Welcome back to The Big Picture. We're talking to United States Attorney James Kennedy from the Western District of New York, and we're talking about all the things that haven't changed really with the coronavirus. I mean, a lot of people have changed their social habits and their work habits because businesses are closing down and so on, but crime continues. And people are being victimized, maybe in different ways because of what's going on. One of the things, and we talked a little bit about this off camera, people ask me for my social security number sometimes, whether it's a doctor's office or dentist office or the bank, and I'm always a little paranoid about giving that out. And I mean, I've been told, well, you only give it out on your tax returns and maybe to your bank when they have to put it down for an account. When should you be concerned about that if somebody asks you for information like that?
Well, I think that's pretty good advice. I mean, generally, obviously, banks sometimes do need that information, and but be careful. You can get a link that looks like it's from your bank, but it's really a scam. So, I mean, always go into, if you're online at least, make sure if you're not going to go into the branch itself and deal with somebody in person, face to face, make sure that you, rather than clicking on a link in an email or something, log into your account on the bank online, and you'll see the secure, that it's a secure website. And if that's the manner in which you need to provide the information, then you can go ahead and do it there. But generally, I mean, the thing that I like to keep in mind is I want to make sure I know where I am, wherever it might be, in terms of, and clicking on a link is usually not a good way to do that. So the best way to do it is if you need to affirmatively give out that sort of personal identifier information, then I would do it by going directly to a trusted website. Generally, I don't give that information out over the phone. My advice is don't give it out over the phone. There's really no reason to, generally, and so I urge people to just not share that information. I don't think it's generally, there may be odd situations. I know personally, where some things these days, because of our inability to have sort of these face-to-face interactions, we need to sort of be creative. But I think, again, put your thinking cap on. If you're going to give that information out, make sure that you know to whom you're actually giving it.
Now, if somebody out there suspects that something is not right, whether it's an email or a phone call, or they're dealing with somebody and the prices seem to be unusual, or whatever the situation is, who do they report it to? When do you want somebody to report something? I mean, obviously we all get emails that are suspicious, and you can't be dealing with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people just saying, hey, I got a strange email. What should we report, and who should we report it to?
Well, I think the strategy that we've employed within the Department of Justice is to have a centralized location or repository in which all this information can be reported. Because although it may seem like a one-off email to you, if it's part of, that's the way these people operate. They cast a very wide net, and if they send 1 million emails, it only takes 1 or 2 fish to bite, and then they can make their, they can get their way with these people. So it's important that these be reported through sort of centralized repositories. Obviously, immediate danger, call 911. But if it's anything other than that, I'd urge people that we have set up a national hotline. It's at disaster@leo.gov. That's lawenforcementofficer.gov, and it's through the National Center for Disaster Fraud. And they have a hotline. You can just pick up the phone and call. It's 1-866-720-5721. And so the advantage of sort of funneling the information into them is that then they can view that information and see what the patterns are. And then that assists us, going back to what we were talking about earlier, being able to identify who these bad actors are. So the other alternatives here in Western New York, call the FBI, 856-7800. You can call them directly and let them know. And any of the DHS.gov, FBI.gov, DOJ.gov websites, you can call and report there, or they can even call my office at 716-843-5700.
We'll try and put all that information on the screen. And one thing I want to talk about too is, and we mentioned it a little bit earlier, there are still overdose deaths that are happening in our community. And the drug trafficking, I'm assuming that hasn't slowed down very
No,
much.
it hasn't slowed down, unfortunately. And I mean, I think that there's a synergy with, as I spoke of earlier, sort of this constant doom and gloom that we're inundated with oftentimes in media, social media, things like that. These individuals that are battling addiction, it's sort of the perfect storm. They're isolated, they're alone, they don't have the resources that they may need to help them as they fight their addiction. Layer over that the fact that there's this sort of this constant feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, and it's a very dangerous combination. So we've seen literally since March 1st in Erie County, as of last weekend, 5 weeks into this thing, pretty much really a doubling from the prior 2 months in terms of the number of overdose deaths. And Western New York, we had prided ourselves on sort of being way ahead of the curve in terms of battling opioids and driving down our overdose death numbers. There was only 106 deaths in Erie County last year to drug overdoses. In March and April alone, there were 38. So it's concerning. It's very concerning. And again, this sort of highlights, I think, the opioid crisis, much like the COVID-19, highlights this interplay between public health and public safety.
This has to do with the drugs that we just talked about, but also the related to the virus problems and the scams and everything that we've just talked about. Western New York is a little bit different than many, many areas of the country because we're right there next to Canada.
Right.
Does that present any unusual problems for you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we are a border district, and it's we're the busiest border crossing at the entire northern border, busier than Detroit, busier than Vancouver, Seattle area. So I mean, it really does largely define our district in terms of our day-to-day operations typically. However, because of sort of the border restrictions right now, traffic across the border is down quite a bit. Although the commercial traffic continues, and our partners at CBP, Customs and Border Protection, remain vigilant in their duties, in terms of making sure that bad stuff doesn't get into the United States. But it's a volume issue, and we see increasingly, a lot of these drugs, in particular, come in through, used to be mainly from China, but now the Mexican cartels have gotten involved, and so a lot of it is, coming in from Mexico on the southwest border. But a lot of times it's easier to get things in from Canada, so it'll go from Mexico to Canada and then down, because it sort of masks the true point of origin for these drugs. So, I mean, we're aware of that and we pay attention to it. I gotta say, I mean, though traffic has been down at the bridges, it's been pretty quiet. And we've been, but I think, if nothing else, I do think that this current crisis really does support the idea that borders matter, and that what goes on, across borders in terms of travel restrictions and everything, I think that that's part of what's having an effect in maybe suppressing some of the very bad numbers that we heard early on.
Well, people being locked down and kind of locked down and sheltering and being cooped up, it's almost like cabin fever on a regional basis or on a national basis. That presents certain problems especially for kids and elderly and certain groups that basically start spending more time on social media and on the internet in general. Who needs to be aware of how these things affect those groups, and what can you do about it?
Right. Well, I think, certainly we've seen in our child exploitation, in the area of child exploitation, very concerning information. It used to be, when I started, as I said, nearly 3 decades ago, child predators were hung out at the playground or in schoolyards, but right now they're in every kid's bedroom because they're in every kid's computer and their social media, so they have access to our kids. So parents need to be vigilant in sort of paying attention what their kids are doing online. Obviously, as we know, there's secure social media apps that that are encrypted, that we've been fighting hard as a government to get access to some of these things, because they're a haven for these child predators. And the Attorney General has been very forward-leaning in trying to get these companies to give us some encryption capabilities so that we can decrypt some of the evidence that of really these awful and heinous crimes. And so again, parents need to pay attention. Parents need to be aware of what their kids are doing. I don't think the answer is just to say you can't do it, because, as I said, we are a country of self-governance, and kids need to learn that at a young age, how to govern their own behavior, how to act responsibly. And you can't do that just by saying you can't have any, and that's going to make them want it more. So parents need to be and talk to the kids about it, and pay attention. And it's not just, it's also then sort of the other end of that scale is the elderly with maybe not being as technologically savvy. They may be more susceptible to the predators if they're financial predators perhaps. And so we need to talk to our parents and elders about that as well.
Well, as so often happens, the time gets very short and things go very quickly. I'd like to wrap this up. I'd like to talk a little bit further about the nature of crime and who becomes a criminal and why they become a criminal, but that's, I guess, a topic for another day. We're going to put the information up on the screen as to how to contact your office, and this has been informative. I think that people need to be aware that bad things are going to continue to happen, and it's not just the coronavirus that we're concerned about. I want to thank the United States Attorney for the Western District of New York, James Kennedy, for being my guest, and we're going to have him back, hopefully, if he can spare the time, and talk again, because we've just scratched the surface on this subject. As always, thank you for watching The Big Picture. Thank you for watching WBBZ-TV. We really appreciate it. This is your station, your local station, and we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.